In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the height of his power. He ruled over most of continental Europe, his enemies broken, his name feared from Lisbon to Warsaw. Yet one empire remained defiant, Russia, refusing to submit to Napoleon's continental system. Tsar Alexander I became the final obstacle between the French emperor and total domination. Napoleon believed one decisive campaign would end Russian resistance. He was wrong. What followed would become the greatest military catastrophe Europe had ever seen. On June 24, 1812, the Grand Armée crossed the Niemen River. More than 600,000 soldiers marched eastward, forming the largest army ever assembled in European history. They came from every corner of Napoleon's empire: French, Poles, Germans, Italians, Austrians, Spaniards, even reluctant Prussians. The army glittered with confidence. Officers spoke of a quick victory, a triumphant march to Moscow, and a decisive battle that would force the Tsar to kneel. No one imagined that most of these men would never return. The Russian strategy was simple but devastating. They refused to fight. They retreated again and again, abandoning cities and villages, scorching the land behind them. Fields were burned, food destroyed, wells poisoned. The deeper Napoleon marched into Russia, the longer his supply lines stretched. The Grand Armée was designed to live off the land. But there was nothing left to take. Hunger arrived before winter ever did. By August, the army was already bleeding. Thousands collapsed from exhaustion. Diseases spread unchecked. Horses died in massive numbers, crippling artillery and supply wagons. Discipline began to erode. Desertion increased. The vast Russian landscape swallowed entire regiments without a single decisive battle. In September, Napoleon finally forced a confrontation at Borodino. The battle was one of the bloodiest single days in history. By nightfall, nearly 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The French technically won, but the Russian army did not collapse. It withdrew once more, broken but alive. Napoleon had gained nothing he needed: no surrender, no decisive victory. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow. Expectations of peace filled the French ranks. They believed the war was over. But Moscow was empty. That night, the city burned. The vast Russian landscape swallowed entire regiments without a single decisive battle. In September, Napoleon finally forced a confrontation at Borodino. The battle was one of the bloodiest single days in history. By nightfall, nearly 70,000 men lay dead or wounded. The French technically won, but the Russian army did not collapse. It withdrew once more, broken but alive. Napoleon had gained nothing he needed: no surrender, no decisive victory. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow. Expectations of peace filled the French ranks. They believed the war was over. But Moscow was empty. That night, the city burned. By October, the first snow fell. It was time to retreat. But the road west would become a corridor of death. The retreat began under relentless pressure. Russian cavalry harassed the columns. Cossacks struck without warning. The wounded were abandoned. The sick were left behind. The temperature plunged. Hunger turned into starvation. Men boiled leather, ate horses, then ate nothing at all. Frostbite blackened fingers and toes. Many soldiers simply sat down and never stood up again. What began as the most powerful army in Europe was now a frozen mass of ghosts, stretched across endless roads, marching not toward victory, but toward extinction. And winter had only just begun. Napoleon remained in Moscow far longer than he should have. Each passing day drained the Grand Armée of strength, hope, and time. The city offered no peace treaty, no supplies, and no shelter from what was coming. The Russian winter approached silently, patiently, as if waiting for its moment to strike. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat in October, it was already too late. The withdrawal began along the same devastated roads the army had used to advance. There was nothing left behind them, and nothing ahead. Russian forces shadowed the columns, striking when the French were weakest. Cossack cavalry appeared like phantoms, attacking isolated units, supply wagons, and stragglers. Every step westward cost lives. The first snowfalls brought panic rather than relief. Soldiers had no winter clothing. Boots fell apart. Feet froze inside torn leather. Frostbite claimed fingers, ears, noses. Men smashed frozen limbs with rifle butts, preferring pain to gangrene. The wounded froze where they lay, forming grotesque markers along the road. Hunger became constant. Horses were slaughtered by the thousands. Their meat was eaten raw, frozen solid in the cold air. When horses ran out, men boiled leather straps, belts, and shoes. Some gnawed on bones already stripped clean. Discipline collapsed entirely. Officers could no longer command men who were barely alive. Entire regiments dissolved. Soldiers wandered off the road, delirious, following hallucinations of warmth and food. Many sat down to rest, convinced they would stand up again. They never did. Their bodies were soon covered by snow, erased from history without a sound. Napoleon himself rode ahead, increasingly detached from the suffering behind him. He still believed the army could be saved. He was wrong. The retreat was no longer a military operation. It was a mass execution carried out by cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Napoleon himself rode ahead, increasingly detached from the suffering behind him. He still believed the army could be saved. He was wrong. The retreat was no longer a military operation. It was a mass execution carried out by cold, hunger, and exhaustion. By November, the retreat had transformed into a living nightmare. The Grand Armée no longer resembled an army. It was a shattered procession of starving men, wounded soldiers, freezing refugees and broken officers, all moving west through a landscape that had become hostile beyond imagination. The cold intensified with terrifying speed. Temperatures dropped far below zero. Snowstorms erased roads, villages and entire units. Men who fell behind vanished without a sound. Hunger ruled every decision. Supplies were gone. Horses collapsed daily, their bodies immediately torn apart by desperate soldiers. Raw meat was eaten frozen, often without fire. Leather boots, belts and saddles were boiled into foul soups. Many men chewed bark, straw, or anything that could deceive the stomach for a few more hours. Discipline collapsed completely. Ranks dissolved. Officers lost authority. Survival replaced loyalty. Frostbite became more deadly than enemy fire. Fingers turned black, then brittle. Feet froze solid inside boots. Soldiers amputated their own toes with knives, or smashed frozen limbs against rocks to break them off. Those too weak to move simply lay down in the snow. Sleep meant death. Entire regiments disappeared overnight, not from battle, but from exhaustion and cold. Russian forces circled like predators. Cossack cavalry struck isolated groups, slaughtering stragglers and capturing prisoners who rarely survived captivity. Artillery, once the symbol of Napoleon's dominance, was abandoned along the roads. Cannons froze into the ground. Wagons snapped apart. The retreat routes became littered with corpses, broken equipment and frozen horses stacked like monuments to failure. As the army approached the Berezina River, panic spread. The river was wide, partially frozen, and guarded by Russian forces. For Napoleon, it represented the final barrier between what remained of his army and survival. Bridges had to be built under fire. Engineers worked knee-deep in icy water, knowing they would not live long after the task was done. When the crossing began, chaos exploded. Tens of thousands surged forward at once. Wagons overturned. Horses screamed. Men drowned beneath broken ice or were crushed by the crowd. Russian artillery pounded the crossings relentlessly. Fires burned on the riverbanks as wounded soldiers froze where they fell. Those who crossed watched in horror as the bridges were destroyed behind them, abandoning thousands to their fate. The Berezina was not a victory. It was a massacre survived by chance. After the crossing, the army no longer fled as a unit. It disintegrated into scattered columns and wandering survivors. Napoleon himself abandoned the remnants of his forces and returned to Paris, leaving his men behind in the snow. Leadership evaporated. What remained of the Grand Armée staggered westward, hollow-eyed and barely alive. By December, the retreat ended. Of the more than 600,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 50,000 emerged in any condition to fight again. Most were dead. Many had simply vanished, swallowed by the Russian winter. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility lay frozen across the roads of Russia. Europe would never fear him the same way again. By November 1812, the Grand Armée no longer resembled an army. It was a moving graveyard. A shattered column of starving men, horseless artillery, and frozen corpses stretched across hundreds of kilometers. What had once been Napoleon's greatest instrument of power had become a mass of walking dead, driven forward by fear rather than discipline. Temperatures dropped below -30°C. Muskets froze solid. Powder became useless. Boots cracked and shattered. Flesh exposed to the wind turned black within minutes. Frostbite claimed fingers, feet, noses, ears. Many soldiers amputated their own limbs with knives or bayonets. Others simply collapsed and were stripped by survivors desperate for clothing. Russian forces closed in relentlessly. Cossacks hovered like vultures, attacking stragglers, slaughtering the wounded, and vanishing into the snow. Artillery thundered against helpless columns that could barely fight back. The retreat was no longer organized. It was instinctual. March or die. The crossing of the Berezina River became the final nightmare. Trapped between advancing Russian armies and an icy river, Napoleon's engineers built fragile bridges under enemy fire. Thousands surged forward in panic. Wagons overturned. Men were crushed, shot, or drowned. The river clogged with bodies. Some tried to swim and vanished beneath the ice. Others clung to the bridges until they collapsed beneath the weight. In 2 days, over 50,000 men were lost. Napoleon watched the slaughter from a distance, his expression unreadable. The emperor who once charged at the head of his army now remained detached, silent, already thinking of Paris, of politics, of survival. In December, he abandoned what remained of the Grand Armée and fled westward in disguise, leaving his soldiers to freeze without him. Only a fraction returned. Out of more than 600,000 who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 crossed back alive. Many were crippled, broken, mentally destroyed. Europe was stunned. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered forever. Enemies rose where fear once ruled. Prussia defected. Austria hesitated. Rebellions ignited. The Russian winter had done what no coalition could do alone. It had broken the greatest army in history and exposed the emperor as mortal. Napoleon would fight on. But the tide had turned. Within 3 years, he would be defeated, exiled, and stripped of his empire. The frozen roads of Russia marked the beginning of his end. The snow erased the footprints, but not the lesson. No army, no matter how powerful, can conquer a land that refuses to surrender. And in 1812, Russia did not just defeat Napoleon. It buried his legend beneath the ice.